Mind the gaps. Get out your lab notebook and find a comfortable seat and see if you can give yourself permission to put down the stressors of your day so far. Just settling into this present moment, and then take a couple of deep, relaxing breaths. All right, so for our experiment today, we'll explore how closely you feel you're currently living by each of the core values you identified and ranked when building your core values hierarchy in our previous experiment. Now, this exploration can be a really powerful tool for increasing your awareness of any gaps that currently exist between the type of life you most want to live and how you tend to spend your time and your attention each day. So, as the physician and psychotherapist Russ Harris and other therapists trained in acceptance and commitment therapy have observed, awareness of these gaps provides a direct path for you to live a more honest and authentic life by more closely aligning your behavior in each moment with your core values. All right, so now let's take some time to review your core values hierarchy in your lab notebook. Once again, assuming you wrote those down. And if not, you might re listen to the previous experiment to generate that written hierarchy before moving on with this experiment. And so let's start at the top of your hierarchy by exploring your number one core value. And for this current experiment, once again, take a few moments to rewrite the name and the brief description of this number one most important value on a new page in your lab notebook. Pausing the audio if you need some more time. And once you have this number one core value written down, I'd like you to write down on a scale from 0 to 100% how important this value is to you at this precise moment in your life. And I know you previously ranked this as your number one core value, but reflecting on your life in this present moment, what percentage of importance would you give this value from 0 to 100%, with 0% being not important at all, 100% being the tippy top of importance for you, and 50% being right in the middle, and anywhere in between being possible? So go ahead and write down this percentage of importance somewhere next to this number one core value. All right. And now, using the same personal scale from 0 to 100%, and as always, giving yourself permission to be completely honest with yourself, using the same personal scale from 0 to 100%, think about how effectively or how consistently you feel you're currently living by this value right now, at this exact moment in your life, with 0% being not at all, 100% being that you're living by this value fully, 50% being you're living by this value to a moderate degree, and anywhere in between these percentages being possible. And now go ahead and write down this percentage of how effectively you feel you're currently living by this number one core value, somewhere next to the percentage of how important this value is to you that you wrote down a moment ago. And as always, pausing the audio if you need some more time. Okay, really great job. So that takes care of your number one core value. And now let's flip back to your core values hierarchy. And we'll repeat this process with your number two, second most important core value on your hierarchy. And like before, take a bit of time to rewrite the name and the brief description of this number two core value in your lab notebook for this current experiment. And once you have this number two core value written down, Write down on a scale from 0 to 100% how important this value is to you currently at this time in your life. And it can be helpful to know that it's totally fine if you have similar percentages of importance across different values. Yes, you previously ranked this value as number two, but the percentage you give it relative to your number one core value or your number seven core value on your list doesn't necessarily have to fall into that hierarchy in this moment. What we're going for here is how important this specific value feels to you right now with regard to the life you most want to live. So, on this personal scale for you in your life right now, what percentage of importance would you give this second core value from 0 to 100% and anywhere in between? And when you've got it, go ahead and write down this percentage of importance somewhere next to the second core value. And again, using the same personal scale of 0 to 100%, how effectively do you feel you're currently living by this value at this exact moment in your life? Writing down this percentage of how effectively you feel you're currently living by the second core value somewhere next to the percentage of how important this value is to you that you wrote down a moment ago. All right. So let's really dive into this experiment and take a few minutes to repeat the same process with the remaining eight core values on your core values hierarchy. So, flipping back to the hierarchy, writing down how important that specific value is to you at this time in your life from 0 to 100%, reflecting honestly on how effectively you feel you're currently living by this value, again from 0 to 100%, writing down that second percentage, and then moving on down to the next core value in your hierarchy until you've finished. And your time and effort here will directly inform our next two experiments that focus on judgments and closing the gaps. So please feel free to take your time here. And so go ahead and pause the audio now, and I'll see you in a few minutes when you're finished. All right. Really great job. And so we're going to use your reflections and those percentages you listed to identify any gaps that currently exist between the values that are most important to you and how you feel you're currently living your life. So let's begin with your number one core value that you started this experiment with. So notice how important you feel this value is to you at this time in your life from 0 to 100%. And then notice how effectively or consistently you feel you're currently living by this value from 0 to 100%. And then we'll do some quick mental math to see if there's currently a gap between the importance you put on this value and how you're currently living your life. So go ahead and take the percentage of how important this value is to you, and then subtract from that the percentage of how effectively you feel you're currently living by this value. So, for example, let's say you listed your number one core value as being 90% important to you at this time. And then you gave yourself a 60% in terms of how effectively you're currently living by this value. So, if we take that 90% and subtract 60%, this reveals a gap of 30% between how important that value is to you and how you're currently living by that value. So once you've calculated any gap that might exist, write down that percentage of a gap in your lab notebook somewhere next to your number one core value. All right. And so now move down to your number two core value. Notice how important you feel this value is to you at this time in your life from 0 to 100%. Notice how effectively you feel you're currently living by this value, again, from 0 to 100%. And then calculate and write down any gap that currently exists between how important the second value is to you and how you're tending to live your life. And as you go through this process, Sometimes you might notice that you don't find a gap, meaning that how you prioritize this value and how you're currently living out this value is pretty consistent from day to day. So, no gaps. And you might even find that the percentage of how effectively you feel you're living by a particular value is actually higher than the percentage of how important that value is to you at this moment, which would actually give you the opposite of a gap, which we can think of as a bit of a surplus of time and energy you're currently devoting to that particular value compared to how important you feel it is right now in your life. So instead of a gap or a hole, you might have a small hill, we could say like a speed bump with regard to that particular value. Okay, and now go ahead and take a few minutes to repeat this process of identifying and writing down any gaps that might exist with your remaining 8 core values that you wrote out. So pause the audio now and then come back when you're finished. Okay, really great job. So let's take a little bit of time to consider what came up for you during this experiment. So go ahead and take a look at what you've written, and in particular, the gaps or the speed bumps that you identified. What does this tell you about how you're tending to spend your time and your attention? As you look these over, do any gaps stand out to you as being particularly important? And if so, you might take a few seconds to underline or circle or put a star next to these gaps. And as you look over your work during this experiment, it can be helpful to think about any specific patterns of your behavior. So, specific actions or emotions, maybe specific thoughts or beliefs that you feel might be contributing to any of the gaps or the speed bumps that you feel are particularly important to you. These insights can help us become much more aware of these patterns when they arise. And as I mentioned at the start of this experiment, this increased awareness points directly to incredibly specific changes you can make to start closing these gaps by more intentionally aligning your moment to moment behavior with your core values, which is a topic we'll revisit in a lot more detail in the upcoming Closing the Gaps experiment. But for now, feel free to pause the experiment and jot down any of these patterns you feel may be contributing to your gaps or speed bumps, and then return to the experiment when you're finished. So, as we bring this experiment to an end and you go about the rest of your day, I'll give you a challenge to become more and more aware of and also curious about instances when these gaps between what you value and how you're behaving appear in your daily life. So, the next time you notice engaging in one of those patterns that you think are contributing to these gaps, notice how this increased awareness of these patterns immediately points to new and possibly more useful decisions that you can make. These are new doors that you can open and explore, where you can then proactively decide in that very moment to change and maybe break these patterns. So, to start filling in these gaps or smoothing out those speed bumps so you can start more fully living the life you truly want to live. How might your life change if you committed to making even one tiny change to just one of the patterns that you identified?